All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today's presentation is going to be managing today's cloud integration data platforms. One of the big things we're going to talk about is some of the myths that need to be busted about the cloud, and also scenarios that customers can use to be able to use it in specific situations. A couple ways of tying it into personal things that we use every single day, as well as an overview of the infrastructure and the way that you can explain it. So just a little about myself. I'm Bradley Ball. I've got around 15 years of IT experience. Cool previous things that I've done. I was the DBA for the U.S. Army, Executive Office of the President. Currently, I'm the Data Platform Management Lead for Pragmatic Works. I'm also a VTSP for Microsoft, which means that if you give them a call and say, hey, how can I use SQL Server in my environment, there's a chance that I could be the guy that gets on the phone to help you figure out how to use that. I've got my ITP in 2005 and 2008. I blog at SQLballs.com. I'm on Twitter at SQLballs. And my email is bball@pragmaticworks.com. So if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. So the agenda for today is we're going to discuss how you can explain the cloud. Because one of the key things to understand is how we can explain this to other people within our business in a way that makes sense not only to them, but makes sense to us as well. We're going to cover some common myths and misconceptions about the cloud, and then we're going to talk about different scenarios of where you can implement it. I also, in the references section, have several really good presentations that I found online. There was one recently on the networking additions and changes that was at TechEd earlier this month. My buddy Max Trinidad, who's a PowerShell MVP, has a really great presentation on PowerShell and Azure, and also some great scripts. And I've got a link to a 2-hour webinar that he recently did for a user group, and also a link to his blog at the end where he's got his deck and his demos available for download. So I'm going to make sure and point those out to you when we get to the end of the deck. And I will make sure that this slide deck is available on my blog at the end of the day. So first off, let's talk about the cloud. It's difficult to explain how and why we should use the cloud. One of the most common things that I encounter as I work with folks is trying to find a way that it makes sense to them of how they can integrate it with their business. On-prem makes a lot of sense to us, but the cloud sometimes can be very abstract. The way I want you to think about it, the best analogy that I've ever been able to come up with for people is to think about the cloud like driving in New York City. It's expensive to park in New York City. It's expensive to own a car in New York City. And this is going to equate to our on-prem servers. Makes sense. We have to have physical structure, we have to have infrastructure, and we're going to invest money, and it's going to depreciate over time. We also have mass transit. We have the subway, we have buses, and we have taxis. And there are varying levels of them, just like we have in the cloud. We have infrastructure as a service, we have platform as a service, and we have many different offerings for infrastructure as a service for the different sizes of VMs we have based on what we need and how we need to get to our location. So when you think about mass transit, that is the cloud. So what I want you to realize is that when we look at the cloud is like driving in New York. It's expensive to drive in New York, but people still do it. And that's the big thing to understand. People are always going to have their own hardware on-prem. You're always going to have the certain systems that are very dependent on high transaction throughput that need that big piece of hardware. And you're going to have people in your corporation that go, I'm willing to invest the money to have this on premise so we can set it up, we can control it. Not everyone, though, can afford to be able to have a car in New York. Most use mass transit, and that's the cloud. If you're starting out a new business nowadays, the startup time to purchase hardware, have a high-speed connection, have a data center, rent space in a data center, rent servers in a data center, can be very, very expensive. One of the key places that the cloud makes sense across the board is for small businesses or startups. But one thing you can also consider is whenever you need to be able to stand up something new. When you're looking at infrastructure costs, you can offset a lot of that by utilizing the cloud and its infrastructure. And some people with cars sometimes use mass transit. Just because somebody has a car in New York doesn't mean they're never going to use the subway, doesn't mean they're never going to use a cab, doesn't mean that they'll never use a bus. It's very, very common to use those things in New York, regardless of whether you own a car or not. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is just because I want my on-prem server, just because I want to have those physical resources in front of me that I can take hold of and I can maintain and I can have control of, that doesn't mean that I can't use the cloud in some way, shape, or form. So remember, the cloud is like driving in New York. Parking is our on-prem. Mass transit is our cloud. And just because I have a car doesn't mean I'm never going to use mass transit. And the way that those scales, the way that we can use them, really depends on the scenario. And that's the big thing to understand. You don't ever want to force the cloud to be to fit into a place where it would not belong. However, there's a lot of places that you can utilize the cloud, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. First up, let's talk about a couple myths. Myth one about the cloud that I want us to tackle. I'm a DBA, and the cloud will replace me. Before we really go that far, we need to understand that the things that the cloud offers, it offers infrastructure as a service, which is essentially SQL Server on Hyper-V, and it offers platform as a service, which is also known as SQL Database. Infrastructure as a service is essentially Hyper-V. That's all it is. It's the ability to provision VMs on the Microsoft backplane. It's incredibly performant, incredibly powerful. You can also provision these VMs quite quickly. It's common to be able to provision one within a couple minutes. And remember, when you work with Hyper-V or you work with virtualization in your current workplace, it hasn't replaced anyone yet. As a matter of fact, the use of virtualization has done nothing but increase the DBA's job. It increases the knowledge that we have to know, increases the studying that we have to know. But if you're already working with VMs, one thing to realize is you can make the jump to infrastructure as a service, and you can immediately use the lessons that you've learned in previous places within your infrastructure. Platform as a service, SQL Database, while it has some limitations on syntax and on physical structures, for example, you cannot have heaps in platform as a service. Everything has to have a clustered index on it. It is not a completely different physical structure. I remember once Connor Cunningham, who's a brilliant guy at Microsoft, he came in front of a group of us and he said, okay, who wants to hear me talk about the cloud for an hour? And everybody sat there and grumbled. And he goes, okay, no problem. Who wants to hear me talk about contained databases, which were new and coming out in 2012? And everybody went, oh yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. So Connor gave his hour-long speech on contained databases. And then when he stopped, he said, and by the way, that's the default security model for SQL Database Platform as a Service. That's absolutely true. When you look at the security model for contained databases, that is the idea behind Platform as a Service, to where it can be solely physically contained without necessarily having to have a physical infrastructure. You still use T-SQL. Security is very, very similar, but it's just contained at the database level. Now, there's some interesting things, such as size limitations, and you have to use DMVs to be able to monitor it. You'll need to do query tuning, and possibly as your database grows, you're going to need to do sharding. And those are all concepts that we face on on-prem systems. So remember, as a DBA, the cloud is not going to do anything to take away your job. As a matter of fact, it's going to leverage the skills that you already have on-prem to be able to utilize within the cloud. So the next myth, I don't have a cloud account. Well, if you have an MSDN account, or if your company has an EA agreement with Microsoft, chances are you've already got an account and you just don't realize it. As a matter of fact, depending on your different type of subscription level with MSDN, you have up to a $50 to $150 credit. If you have an EA agreement, every EA agreement with an MSDN subscription has a $200 credit. Right now, if you're not investing in using the cloud and you've got these things sitting before you, you're essentially throwing away money. And the way I would want you to think about that is think about it like having a 401k. If your company does a matching plan of any sort and you're not investing in 401k, then you're throwing away free money. The exact same thing, if you have an MSDN license or you have an EA agreement with Microsoft, I guarantee you, you've got hundreds of dollars sitting there not being used. And one thing you should do is you should talk to your Microsoft rep. First off, figure out what your monthly limit would be, and then take a look at how you can leverage that, so that way you can actually start utilizing that data. It's a wonderful way to be able to begin leveraging things, because the second that you have a cloud account set up and you understand that you have a budget, then you can begin playing around with it and slowly looking at how you can expand and use it. That's the first prohibitive thing about the cloud, is many people think that they do not have an account. Also, it's not that expensive. One of the things to keep in mind is if you shut down, oh, let me go to the next slide. My clicker stopped working on me. So talking about how it's expensive, when you look at the price breakdown, if you wanted to stand up a 4-core virtual machine, that works out to $2.10 an hour for Enterprise Edition. One thing to remember is that if you shut down your account, you do not pay for those virtual machines. You only pay to maintain the storage. 2014 is out. 2014 on on Windows Azure is actually getting patches and cumulative updates at a very quick rate. If you go and you provision a 2014 box, you're going to get the latest and greatest with the cumulative update 1, which interestingly enough, when you deploy it, says Service Pack 1, so I'm not sure whether it's CU1 or Service Pack 1 for 2014, but that build number is already in place if you go and provision one in the cloud. If you want to play around with 2014 on an enterprise level license to be able to see how you could use in-memory OLTP or buffer pool SSDs or any other advanced feature that you're looking at, if you spent 4 hours a week, it would essentially work out to about $80 a month for that 4-core VM. That's not a lot of money to be able to have a 4-core SQL Enterprise Edition licensed VM. And that's typically something you could go to your boss and say, hey boss, we need to spend $80 a week so that way I can spend time and learn. And let's be honest, we don't, as DBAs, normally get 4 hours a week that we actually get to do on other things. That may end up being 8 or 9 hours an actual week instead of 4 hours a day. But it's still a very, very cheap investment. There's also a Microsoft Azure pricing for virtual machines. And even though you see the limits right there of 8 cores, you can actually do more advanced builds. You can get up to 16 cores. You can get about 50 gigs of RAM is the highest I've seen. And you can get above 16 cores and above 50 gigs of RAM. You have to call in to the Windows Azure helpline, though, to be able to get that provision. But you can absolutely provision VMs that are much larger than that. Keep in mind that infrastructure as a service sitting up in Hyper-V has the exact same limits as what you could get on the cloud, because that's essentially what you're using behind the scenes. Right now, the limits on Hyper-V, I want to say, are 64 logical cores, and I want to say 1 terabyte of RAM. The thing to keep in mind is I don't know anybody that's actually provisioned that's something that big on infrastructure as a service, and I'm sure that would be quite expensive. There's going to be a point in time when it starts to scale and scale cost-wise, but it's absolutely possible to provision something like that. You just have to, when you go above 16 cores, actually contact Microsoft support. So the next myth about the clouds, it's not for Tier 1 level systems. Microsoft uses it for Xbox. They use blob storage, table queues for cloud game saves, Halo 4, Xbox Music, Xbox Live, etc. And we all know how wonderfully forgiving gamers are. They never like to thrash anybody on social media. So that's a pretty good Tier 1 level system. Skype. We use Skype very, very regularly at Pragmatic Works. I've used it in other countries. I've used it from state to state. Use it extensively. And Skype uses blob storage, tables, queues to allow video and messaging. And Bing. Bing is actually, it's one of the search engines that I've begun using quite a bit more lately. And if you use it to do searches for social media, all the social media updates that come from Twitter and from Facebook feeds onto Bing use Azure storage behind the scenes. It's very important to understand that the backplane that all of that is sitting on is a 1 terabyte backplane. How many, real quick poll, anybody know what the backplane is that they have? If you type it in the chat window, if anybody has a 1 terabyte backplane in their data center, I'd love to know about it because that's really, really impressive. And this is the only place that I've ever seen it before. But very, very performant, very with a lot of uptime. Not only that, we've gotten recently the ability, 3 gigabytes. Oh, that's a great one, Greg. 3 gigabytes. That's still a great backplane. Very, very performant, I would imagine. Just imagine that at 1 terabyte, and that's what they've got sitting in the Microsoft data centers where Azure is hosted. So, again, a very, very powerful backplane. The other thing to keep in mind is that they have kind of ate their own dog food at Microsoft. They have said we're all in on the cloud. Every tier 1 level system they have is running on the cloud, which is pretty impressive when you think of all the different things that Microsoft does, the different services that they provision internally, as well as the customer-facing systems. It's only for small business, businesses that cannot afford data centers. You're absolutely right. Let's see, who else? Yeah, Boeing, BMW, Xerox, Jackson Hewitt, Volvo, NBC Sports, Toyota, the City of London, all very, very small businesses. And that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that these would definitely be our hybrid folks that have their own on-prem data centers but also leverage the cloud. There's big savings to be had when you do not have to pay the power bill for your data center, when you do not have to pay for the depreciation of the physical hardware, and you get to shut things down and only pay for the storage. So you have a major sporting event and you need to have additional support and scale. You spin up more VMs, and then whenever that sporting event is over, you spin them back down. Or if you know you have a large production cycle coming up, maybe for something like a tax service, or for something like automobile industry or a plane industry, where you know that you need to spin up infrastructure at a particular time and then be able to spin it back down, that's a huge cost saving. More myths. Let's see. Microsoft expects me to switch everything to the cloud. Now, salespeople are salespeople. When you do talk with some of the folks that you have at Microsoft that will be pitching the cloud to you, they would absolutely love it if you shifted everything to it. Buck Woody has done a fabulous job over the years of putting together blog series on the way to be able to scale, doing elastic scale to be able to scale up and scale down, the agility to set up new environments quickly, looking at hybrid applications that need the ability to use distributed data on both on-prem and within the cloud environment, and also the ability to be able to scale past infrastructure limits. There are a lot of wonderful things to use it, and that's the thing, is if someone ever takes and says, yes, we want to move everything into the cloud, wouldn't necessarily say slap them, but just remind them that the cloud is a wonderful place for a lot of things. It's not appropriate for everything. We want to use it how it fits our business. We wouldn't want to go and re-architect every single application within our infrastructure. However, when we look at new things have a good chance of being able to go to the cloud and have a lot of cost savings. I had a client I was talking to the other day, and they needed to stand up a whole new application, and they wanted always-on availability groups with it. The cloud actually has the ability to do geo-replication of SAN data from one of their data centers to another data center. They have the ability now that they've introduced it in networking to be able to actually have always-on availability groups that sit at different data centers. The cloud is very, very quickly scaling to be able to offer you the ability to use Microsoft data centers as your own in a very quick and easy and affordable way. So another thing to keep in mind is whenever we, that right now we're all winners because Amazon, Google, and Windows Azure are all in a bit of a bidding war. And every single time one of them drops their price, the others tend to drop their prices as well. And I want to say just about a month ago, we got everybody to reduce their storage costs once again because I believe Amazon did it, and then Google did it, and then Azure Storage did it. So we're also in a great period right now where when one of them begins bidding against one another, we win. Another myth to keep in mind with the cloud, backing up databases would be too expensive. In SQL Server 2014, we get the ability to add a blob storage account and back up to the cloud. In 2012, post-cumulative update 2, we get that ability as well. I cannot remember the cumulative update, but that's also available for 2005. That's also available for 2008 and 2008 R2. Now, I hear what most of you are thinking, though, because backing up that data to the cloud, you're going to have to take up space there, and that's going to be rather expensive. So on the lookup calculator that they have on the Azure site, they have a pricing calculator for just about anything you need. If you were to have 1 terabyte of backup space that you had on the cloud, it would take $280 a month. Now that terabyte is cumulative in size. So if you want to have multiple days on hand, if you want to be able to store multiple backups up in the cloud, you need to look at what your overall size is going to be and factor that to be what you want to scale. And the way the pricing works is going to be whatever the average size is that you keep for a month. So let's say, for example, you used 100 gigabytes of total backup space for the first half of the month. You were just testing this out. And then for the second half of the month, you deleted up the extra backups because you didn't need to keep them there anymore. You would be billed for 50 gigabytes of space because for the entire month, for the first half of the month, you used 100 gigabytes. For the second half of the month, you used 50 gigabytes. 0 gigabytes. That averages to 50. And the thing to remember right now is the first 5 gigabytes of data that you store is free. So you would only get billed for 45 gigabytes at 28 cents per gig, which works out to $12.60 per month. If you took 95 gigabytes, let's say we kept that whole 100 gigabytes and we used that amount of storage for the entire month, that works out to $26.60 per month that you would actually get charged. That's huge, because the main thing you look at when you look at using Azure backups and backup storage is you look at the gigabyte charge. It's wonderful to know that that averages out, and when you look at the size of your databases that you're dealing with, that's really not that bad for around 100 gigs to only be charged $26 a month. If you want more on the pricing categories, you can click on that calculator when you get the deck, or you could just Google the Azure Microsoft pricing calculator, and it'll pull right up. And one of the things you can do is you can slide that scale. I think the maximum backup size that it currently goes to is about 5.5 or 6 terabytes in size. And at that point in time, you're spending about $3,000 or $4,000 per month. Pretty incredible, though, to think that you could add an additional 5 terabytes of backup space for just a couple $1,000s. When you think about purchasing a SAN and how much money and how much cost you'd have to put in place to be able to put in 5 terabytes worth of storage on your infrastructure right now, a lot more than $4,000. The internet is slow between my data center and Azure. That's a big problem, right? One of the things you have to consider is when you begin using Azure, it's a completely separate data center, and you are at the mercy of the speed of the internet. Well, one of the things that they announced recently was they announced ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute partners with AT&T, BT, Equinox, Level 3, Telecity Group, and also Verizon. So if you're currently using any of these telco providers, either for your broadband connection or for the connection within your data centers, one of the things you can do is you can get ExpressRoute through Azure. This will give you a lot of additional speed. As a matter of fact, you can see right here, it's going to include an outbound data transfer rate, but you can see that at the basic level you can get up to 200 megabytes per second, 500 megabytes per second, 1 gigabyte per second, or 10 gigabytes per second. So when you look at actually implementing something like backups, one of the things to keep in mind is if you're backing up to the cloud, you're only going to be as fast as the infrastructure that you're backing up over. This buys a separate pipe specifically for your Azure level services to be able to make sure that you've got that connection. Most infrastructures are trying to modify their current infrastructures to get up to have a 10 gig backplane. That's one thing to look at, is that you could actually go up to 10 gigs right now. That's a really huge pipe to be able to connect directly to an Azure data center. When you even get up to the 1 gigabyte or the 500 megabytes per second, you get within the range where if you needed an on-prem to an Azure availability group, you could do that. If you want to move your data over to an Azure data center and you want your application to still remain on-prem or vice versa, having a very wide pipe would allow you to have millisecond latency, effectively being able to transmit over that large distance very quickly. So one thing to keep in mind is you don't have to have a slow connection to the cloud. Right now the internet is kind of like the wild, wild west for a packet. A packet goes out there and eventually it goes through a route and it makes it to an Azure data center or it makes it to your data center. More partners will be announced and are going to be included as the year goes along. So this is a feature that's going to grow and grow and grow. But one thing to keep in mind is that the level of latency that you can set up between your Azure data centers and your on-prem locations has been drastically reduced by this feature. Also, just to let you know, ExpressRoute has full PowerShell support. The latest PowerShell commandlet, I want to say, is PowerShell 4.0, and there's an Azure set of commandlets that you need to go and download. We'll have the Get Azure Dedicated Circuit Provider, the ability to create the circuit links, to be able to remove them if you want to get rid of it, and they're even offering free trials of ExpressRoute right now. So some really, really interesting stuff that we've got available to us in the cloud. So another myth about the cloud, security. I don't want my data up there in the cloud anywhere. I don't want just anyone to be able to get to it. I would imagine that many of you out there have probably had security concerns when it comes to the cloud and it comes to Azure. So let me ask you real quick. Out there, does anybody, how many people, if you wouldn't mind throwing in a yes or no, how many people have access to their data centers? Got about 56 people online. Let's see. No, yes, okay, Kirby doesn't, Greg does, Jana doesn't, Lori does, okay. Yep, I'm seeing some more come through, okay. So, yes, you have access to your data center. Some of you don't. How many of you know people that have access to your data center? Do you know anybody within your company that has access to your data center? Okay. Yep. All right. I'm getting a lot of yeses pouring in right now. Okay. So how many people have access to a Microsoft data center? Or do you know someone that has access to a Microsoft data center? Yeah. Okay. No? No? Yeah? No? Okay. I've got a person for Microsoft in here who says I do. Okay, so that's one out of many. No, that's wonderful. Thanks. Thank you for all the responses. So that's something to keep in mind. Is immediately we restrict at a very high level the number of people that have access to a Microsoft data center. Do you believe your security requirements that you have for your data are probably greater than the NSA? Or do you believe that they're greater than the Executive Office of the President? That's one thing to keep in mind, because I can tell you that both of them are storing data right now on the cloud. And that should give you an idea of the level of security that is actually involved in the cloud. Right now, at the Microsoft Virtual Training Academy, you can see that they've got a Windows Azure Security Overview. I've gone through that. And they do a wonderful job of showing the biometric security, the passes. They actually give you a tour of the floor to show the restricted access that actually occurs at a data center. So if you have any questions or you want to be able to educate yourself on this so you can explain the level of security that's in place that prevents people from just having random access to the servers in your data, especially within your own company, this is a really good thing to go watch. As well, Microsoft Azure actually has a Trust Center security web page just to talk about how secure they are. And it's got a lot of different subjects up there. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you went and you talked to your CEO or you talked to the head of your network admin team and you said, we're going to be as secure as the NSA in the Office of the President, they'd probably be pretty happy, unless they came from those places and they decided that they could do better. But let me tell you, that's a pretty high level of security that's already set up for those data centers. The fact that they're using the clouds mean that they have been fully vetted, that they have fully vetted those locations before they put anything up there. So let's talk about a couple different scenarios of why we may want to use the cloud, what the infrastructure may look like that we would be able to get our business to utilize. The business scenario one that I want to talk about is access hell. I was working with a company, they're a $1 billion company, and they had long waits to get new servers. I'm sure, like many of you, if you work for a very large company, you understand that there's probably a limited number of server admins, probably a limited number of DBAs. There's a lot of places that have put up private cloud implementations just to be able to get around that or use provisioning and PowerShell and different methods to be able to stand up servers as quickly as possible. But even then, you still have to have configuration, best practices. You have to add the groups and the logins to the servers. It takes a long time to be able to get and stand up a server. And what I found with this company is they stored a lot of mission-critical data in Excel and Access. As a matter of fact, they were making daily million-dollar decisions off of data that sat in Excel and Access. This company probably isn't alone. There are probably companies out there right now, and there may even be a few of you in the audience that sit there and go, yeah, I know a couple places where we're storing data, and it's not able to be backed up. If somebody's desktop fails, we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. And sometimes you just sit there and you go, there's no oversight whatsoever in storing this data that we're making business decisions in Office data. If you're uploading those files to SharePoint, sure, you may have the ability to have those backed up and saved within SharePoint, but the one thing that I would definitely want to stress is you need oversight. You need the ability for people to check that data. As a matter of fact, there was one particular business unit that I ended up working with, and I sat down with the person that was in charge of it, and we were looking at the data that they had in Access, and we were moving it to the cloud, and they were very specific about the fact that they needed the ability to change the data in the database instead of just read it. And I said, well, why do you need to change the data? Because it was mainly created from batch jobs. And they said, well, sometimes those numbers aren't quite correct, and they don't report the true level of profit that I want to pass on. Needless to say, that's kind of fraudulent behavior. So one thing to keep in mind is whenever you're keeping data in a system like Excel and Access and it's completely unmanaged, you have no way of being able to track and actually validate that that data is something that you should be making business decisions off of. So one of the things that we did for them was we looked at an Azure account to be able to provision either platform as a service or infrastructure as a service SQL servers so that they could very quickly set up their own SQL servers and set up their data. This company preferred to keep these things on-prem, but by setting them up in the cloud, having their network connected, they were able to back up those databases and restore them on local systems and then blow those servers away once they were done with the cloud system. And they slowly took and they transitioned 1,250 Access databases over into a series of infrastructure as a service, multiple databases on instances, because that'd be a lot of VMs to spin up. And then one at a time they would back up those databases, move them to an on-prem system as they were able to get those set up, and then they were able to close down what they had on Azure. But it gave them a good space to be able to begin experimenting with it. And there is a business scenario we'll come to in a moment where I'll discuss the next thing they began using Azure for. Cloud scenario 2, scaling out data loads. One of the places that we worked with was a very large college. They had to scale and process a lot of batch files. And as you could expect, this tended to correspond with enrollment in different parts of the year when they were adding a lot of students, or they had to process a lot of grades, and they had to get a lot of information out, or they had to produce a lot of materials to be able to recruit or make offer letters to certain student athletes. They needed to be able to reduce their servers, reduce their licensing, and reduce their power cost, but still be able to be more performant. One of the things we did was we moved a lot of their processing structure up into the cloud. Using PowerShell, we were able to spin up additional SSIS servers to do batch processing jobs to their on-prem database. When we didn't need to have so many servers, we spun down the majority of them, and we would even turn off the SSIS servers for a period of hours, because there were times during the day or during the night when we knew the batch processes would be running, and that way they would only pay for the storage of their packages. If you work with business intelligence, you work with SSIS, you understand that the packages themselves that are stored in SSIS, or even the SSIS DB if you're using SQL Server 2012 to be able to store platform and connection manager, the cost and the size of that is very, very small. You're talking about a lot more storage for the operating system in and of itself than anything you're actually putting on the database. The ability to spin down those servers and just pay for the storage related to huge cost savings. I want to say that geo-replicated storage data right now is about 5 cents per gigabyte. And it stays at that rate up until the first terabyte, and at the terabyte level, they actually start reducing the cost. We didn't need to do geo-replicated data for them, and I think we just did the standard data, and that's 2 cents per terabyte. Very, 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 very inexpensive. I'm sorry, per gigabyte up until the first terabyte. So cloud scenario 3, scaling your backup infrastructure. Another large Fortune 500 business we were working with. They needed to back up all their servers. Their servers equated to petabytes of data per day. One of the things they used is they used a service called Iron Mountain. I've used this service with a couple different places. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. One of the things that Iron Mountain does is it takes your tape backups, picks them up daily, and then it stores them in their facility. You'll have a retention period of time. The retention period for this particular customer we were using was about 2 weeks, but they had petabytes between Oracle, Informix, Teradata, DB2, many, many different platforms, and SQL Server that got backed up daily. And so it wasn't something where they could have just a lot of sand sitting around as extra space for these backups. But one of the problems is they had a lot of Tier 1 systems. And if you have a Tier 1 system that you ever need to recover a database, and it got to the point where if the DBA suspected a problem may have occurred, where they may need a database backup, they had to immediately bring the tapes back. And that was a cost of about $5,000 per tape that needed to come back. And then you still had to wait about 2 hours for it to get to your data center. And then it had to get injected into the silo, presented to you to where you could use that tape to be able to then restore your database. If you have a Tier 1 level system, 2 hours is a long time to wait for a backup. It's even longer when the tape gets there and you're waiting for the minutes for the restore to begin. Not only that, they began to hit a bottleneck where they had so much data that was being processed and backed up between the midnight to 4 a.m. hours that their tape infrastructure and their network saturation made it to where their backups were backing up at just about 25 megabytes per second for some of their larger systems. They had backups that were taking full days, or backups that were requiring them 4 hours that were now getting pushed out to 8. One of the things they needed was they needed the ability to be able to have additional infrastructure for backups. One of the things that we did for them was we used Azure Blob Storage. It would have been very cost prohibitive to back petabytes of data up to the cloud. That was something that just wasn't going to work out. But what we did was we identified their Tier 1 systems and about a terabyte of data within those Tier 1 systems. And we worked up a retention pattern for them. And using compression, we were able to get 3 days worth of backups on hand sitting up in the cloud at any one particular point in time. It was extremely cost effective for them, and it made it to where they just had to pull down that data to be able to do a restore instead of recovering a tape. So if there was a problem, they had a little bit of time to investigate it, or if there was a problem, they could immediately begin pulling down a restore. Now, for larger backups, it's certainly something where we would look at recommending ExpressRoute. They had a very robust pipe going between their data center, and it was about 500 megabytes per second. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, is if you're looking at pulling down hundreds of gigabytes or terabytes in size, you want to keep in mind that you want that storage to be robust enough to be able to pull down that data. But keep in mind the storage that you currently have on-prem. A 500 megabyte pipe connection from wherever your storage is to your server is typically going to be more than you need to be able to do the restores for SQL Server. So that's a pretty good sized pipe. Oh, and they needed to beat the tape storage turnaround time. So one of the things to keep in mind is how you could take something like that and you could scale that conversation at a personal level to be able to make it more allegorical for when you're doing work. So one that I thought up for myself was scaling my backup performance because I had years of family pictures. I had some NAS devices, extra hard drives. I even kept around a couple extra computers that had kind of gone past their age after a while, just to be able to use them as servers on my personal network to back up. I also needed a better way to be able to share and distribute. The way that I currently back up family pictures, videos, I'm able to avoid hardware cost, and I'm able to share and distribute things very easily, so I currently use OneDrive for that. Another thing to keep in mind is OneDrive is one of those things that is using cloud storage, using file blobs, tables, and queues. So if you currently have a OneDrive account, that's a wonderful scenario to be able to equate that to what you would be doing for your business. Very easily, I was able to take all the videos, a couple gigs worth of information, which was a very, very insignificant cost, pop that up on the cloud, and then anytime I wanted to share a video or take a group of pictures, new set of pictures, and I wanted to share them with family, I could very easily just email a link out to my OneDrive and allow family to go out there and pull down pictures or look at them or browse them, whatever they'd like. So keep in mind that we have ways that we use the cloud right now every single day, and those are going to be the most powerful ways that we can turn around and translate that to our business to help them understand scenarios where it kind of tears down those walls. A lot of people use Dropbox, or they use OneNote, or they use some type of cloud storage, or they have an iPhone and they back up their stuff to the cloud, or they have an Android and that backs up their stuff to the Google Cloud. It's important to take those scenarios and be able to leverage those, because once you start bringing it home and going, hey boss, you're already using the cloud, it makes it a lot less scary when you look at how you want to implement that for your business. Another scenario, and this would be the first company that I spoke about, once they started spinning down all those different VMs, they realized that Azure was a wonderful way for them to be able to use development environments quickly and cheaply. They had long waits getting new servers, and that equated to reduced developer capacity. If you are a developer out there, you know what it's like to ask for a server and ask for a server, and when is the server going to be online so I can finally start developing against it. One of the great things is when you go to the Azure portal and you provision a virtual machine, within minutes you will actually have that machine sitting there with you. The provisioning time is very, very quick. It's absolutely amazing. And within those couple minutes you can have anything within the MSDN catalog that's currently supported. You can have a 2005 server, 2008, 8R2, 2012, or 2014. This gives you the ability to explore new technologies quickly, reduce servers, and reduce licensing costs. Remember, you pay for it as you spin it up. If you have a POC that's going to run for a couple weeks, that's a lot of work to spin up an infrastructure just for something that's only going to last for a couple weeks. One of the things that you could do is you can leverage Azure VMs to be able to spin up that infrastructure quickly. And then a couple references that I want you guys to be able to go and find. Buck Woody has done a lot of work in the cloud. His blog over at MSDN has a lot of great stuff. He did, back in 2011, a summary of different use cases, things where he had worked with clients and customers to be able to get them migrated to the cloud, and a lot of those lists are there so you can find different use cases. What's new in Azure networking is from the 2014 event that happened just this month for TechEd North America. It's a really good overview of express routes and also a couple demos that they use as well. The ability to configure an express route and connecting through an exchange provider. There's a GUI way to be able to do this, as well as utilizing PowerShell. You can find all that on that MSDN article. did technical overview for express routes, also available. And if you go to the pricing calculator also has information for express routes as well. And then Max Trinidad, again, does a great presentation on PowerShell and SQL Server databases, showing how you can leverage PowerShell to be able to implement and provision services within the cloud, to set up your subscriptions, and also to be able to provision your blob accounts that you'll use for your different VMs. This is also a link to the YouTube video, which he has currently on his blog, and it was about a 2-hour presentation that he did for the Florida SQL Server user group, and it was a fabulous presentation. So if that's something you're interested in, I absolutely recommend that you go out and check that out.